a government official wrote a warning. The subject was an upcoming medical trial, an experimental vaccine study targeting newborn infants in Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan. The official noted, in plain administrative language, that the children selected were direct wards of the federal government and therefore were not in a position to exercise voluntary cooperation. He added, in case of difficulties arising, the government itself could not be without responsibility. The trial proceeded. The Indian residential school system operated in Canada from the 1880s through to 1996. It housed tens of thousands of Indigenous children separated from their families, often by force, and placed in institutions funded by the federal government and administered by Christian churches. Funding was sparse by design. Per capita grants to the schools were roughly half of what was required to provide a nutritionally balanced diet. By the mid-20th century, malnutrition was a structural constant inside these schools. Chronic starvation compromised immune systems. Tuberculosis spread through dormitories and dining halls. In 1942, the tuberculosis death rate among Indigenous peoples in Manitoba was 1,400 per 100,000. In the white population that same year, it was 27. Federal bureaucrats and national medical institutions responded not by addressing the poverty that produced these numbers, but by categorizing them. The disparity was labeled Indian tuberculosis. The explanation offered was racial. This framing justified the creation of 33 racially segregated hospitals across the country. The government said to protect the settler population from contagion. They operated at roughly half the cost of standard community hospitals. A research team traveled by bush plain and dogs led to 5 northern Manitoba Cree communities: Norway House, Cross Lake, God's Lake, Rossville, and The Pass. The team included federal nutritionists and doctors. Their stated purpose was to document the baseline nutritional status of the residents. What they found was severe chronic starvation. At Norway House and Cross Lake, the majority of residents were sick enough to be bedridden. Elderly community members were on the verge of death. Families were subsisting on white flour, sugar, lard, and jam. Rather than providing emergency food relief, the government saw an opportunity for research. The vitamins newly isolated in the 1930s and 1940s, thiamine, riboflavin, ascorbic acid, were not yet well understood at a clinical level. And here was a population malnourished enough to provide meaningful data. 300 residents were enrolled as subjects. 125 received various combinations of vitamin supplements. The remaining 175 served as an untreated control group, kept exactly as they were so the progression of nutritional deficiency could be observed. The experiment ran as planned. In 1948, Dr. Lionel Bradley Pett, director of the Federal Nutrition Services Division, designed a 5-year controlled study to be conducted across 6 residential schools. Approximately 1,000 Indigenous children would be enrolled. Pett was the principal author of Canada's official food rules, the document that would eventually become the Canada Food Guide. The study used what the institutions already provided: captive subjects, complete administrative control over diet, and a pre-existing condition of measurable malnutrition. Parents were not informed. No consent was sought from children or communities. Under the Indian Act, the children were wards of the state. Participation was not a choice. Each school was assigned a different experimental variable. At Alberni Indian Residential School in British Columbia, children were identified as severely riboflavin deficient. The planned intervention was to triple their daily milk ration from 8 ounces to 24. Before that began, Pett ordered the children held on the inadequate 8-ounce ration for 2 additional years. A baseline had to be established. During those 2 years, the deficiency continued. At Shubenacadie, in Nova Scotia. Children with widespread gingivitis were divided into two groups without their knowledge. One received daily vitamin C tablets, the other received placebos. At St. Mary's in Kenora, Ontario, children were fed an experimental flour mix containing synthetic vitamins and bone meal that was prohibited in the rest of Canada under existing food safety law. Children on this diet developed higher rates of anemia. There was one more element to the design. Correspondence held in Library and Archives Canada, Record Group 29, Volume 2989, contains explicit instructions from Dr. Pett to school dentists. Withhold all standard dental treatments. No care for tooth decay or gingivitis. The reasoning was clinical. Dental health was being used as a clinical marker for nutritional deficiency. To treat the decay would compromise the data. At St. Paul's Indian Residential School in Cardston, Alberta, designated as the Master Control School, children were identified as severely deficient in vitamins A, B, and C, in iron and in iodine. No dietary interventions were made for the entire 5-year duration of the study. The BCG vaccine trial had begun 15 years earlier. In 1933, Dr. Robert George Ferguson, director of Saskatchewan's Fort Capel Sanatorium, enrolled 609 Cree and Nakota Oyadebi newborn infants in a 12-year vaccine experiment. 306 received the vaccine, 303 did not. The trial was funded by the National Research Council and the Department of Indian Affairs. 3 years before the trial began, 71 infants in Lübeck, Germany had passed away from a contaminated batch. The international safety concerns were documented. They were known. By the end of Ferguson's trial, 77 of the 609 infants had died before their first birthday. Close to 1/5 of all subjects died during the course of the study. Only 4 of those deaths were attributed to tuberculosis. The majority died from gastroenteritis and pneumonia, diseases driven by poverty and poor living conditions that no vaccine could reach. The trial was published in major medical journals. It was cited as a success. The Charles Camsell Indian Hospital opened in Edmonton in 1946. Between 1971 and 1974 alone, 125 sterilizations of Indigenous women were documented at the facility. These procedures occurred under Alberta's eugenics legislation and with federal administrative oversight. Clinical drug trials were also conducted at Camsell, testing multiple preparations of the anti-tuberculosis drug para-aminosalicylic acid and evaluating thyroid-stimulating hormones on institutionalized patients. Patients underwent repeated lung collapse therapies, twice-weekly injections of air directly into the chest cavity, and thoracoplasties, the surgical removal of sections of ribs under the spine. Former patients stated these operations were performed under local anesthetic. They were rarely, if ever, performed on non-Indigenous patients during the same period. Doreen Calihu was admitted to Camsell at the age of 8. She spent 11 of the next 12 years confined there. She eventually had an entire lung surgically removed, the accumulated consequence of the procedures she had undergone. She was not asked whether she consented to any of it. In May 2013, a food historian named Ian Mosby, working through files in Library and Archives Canada, found the memos. He uncovered a paper trail, dental restriction orders, internal planning correspondence, and documents outlining the creation of the control groups. He published his findings in the journal Social History. 2 months later, in July, national media ran the story across front pages. The Assembly of First Nations passed an emergency resolution characterizing what the record showed as Crown conduct reflecting a pattern of genocide. The First Nation, whose children had attended the Alberni school, demanded a formal public apology. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada incorporated the findings into its final report. Indian hospital survivors filed a class action lawsuit seeking over $1 billion in damages. On June 24, 2025, the Federal Court of Canada approved a historic settlement agreement establishing a $385.5 million foundation alongside an additional $150 million for Indigenous services. Claims officially opened in January 2026. The settlement covers physical and psychological abuse. It explicitly excludes compensation for injuries resulting from medical experiments. Ian Mosby and Dr. Tracy Galloway published a study in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. It examined the metabolic legacy of institutional starvation in residential schools. The chronic undernourishment they found had caused measurable sociological adaptations in those who survived it. Those adaptations were present in their children and in their grandchildren. The experiments ended, the records were archived, and what had been done to the body continued, quietly passed from one generation to the next without anyone's consent.